Hey, friends, welcome to another episode of the In the Business podcast. I'm your host, Juan Alanis, and I'm excited for the conversation that you are about to listen to today with Fidel Martinez, who's the editorial director for the new Latino product by the Los Angeles Times that just got rolled out in the month of July. This is actually their second month. We're in September, so this is actually the third month that we're in of existence. And Fidel is going to tell us a little bit more about his journey and the path to creating this new product from the Los Angeles Times called Delos. So get ready. It's a great conversation. Very nice guy. Also from the RGV, which was really cool. Puro 956. So enjoy the conversation. Fidel, it's an honor to have you here today. It's an honor to be speaking with you today for our podcast in the business. And I'm excited to speak to you about what you're working on now, because I know it's something really interesting, really compelling for our community. And I'm talking about Delos, which is a new, I'm going to call it a Latino product from the Los Angeles Times, for the Latino market. But Fidel, I'll let you introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about what Delos is.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Fidel Martinez, and I am the editorial director for Latino Initiatives at the LA Times. And you are correct, Delos is a Latino product from the LA Times. And basically, what it is that it's a new platform agnostic vertical that is focused on Latinidad, culture, and identity. It's not meant to explain us, but rather to cover our community, right? And so the lens, our slogan is everything Latinidad, which is more aspirational than anything because Latinos in the United States account for nearly 20% of the population, which is roughly 60 plus million people. And to our goal is to tell as many of those stories as possible, right? Knowing that there's so many stories there to be told that will never truly capture the entirety of the Latino experience, but it's aspirational. And when I say platform agnostic, I mean that we are doing, we are we're publishing written stories, but we're also doing stories on our social media platforms since our audience is much young. It skews young, and so our
Mhm.
mindset is that you have to meet the audience where they are. Right. Our goal is to move away from what I call the field of dream style of journalism, which is if you build it, they're going to come. Which that hasn't really proven to be the case. Right. I feel
Right.
that in an era in which so many different products and so many different things are vying for your attention, we have to take that extra step of being where our audience is.
Tell me the slogan again.
The slogan is everything Latinidad.
Now let's talk about the journey getting here. Uh, let's start with from a publication perspective, but then I also want to talk for you personal journey. Kind of getting to this point because you're the editorial director, correct?
That is correct.
For Delos. Okay, so let's take it from the publication perspective first. What was that process like to get to the point where you were able to launch this new product and getting the buy-in and everything else to be able to put it in market.
Yeah, I mean, I think the genesis of it really is the Latin X Files newsletter, which is a weekly newsletter that I was a part of creating. I pitch the idea and I write it, every week. And the goal was this idea was first pitched to management while I was a member of the audience engagement team here at the LA Times, which what that means is that I was working in the social media side of like the paper and specifically working with the sports desk. I was assigned to the sports desk and I really enjoyed my job. I loved it. I mean, I basically got paid to tweet from live sporting events. I got to go to the Super Bowl and the World Series, and it was a great job by all accounts, right? But prior to joining the Times, I had spent about a decade working in Latino centric media. Before I came to the Times, I was a politics editor for We Are Me Too. And then before that, I was working for Fusion, which is the now defunct joint venture between Univision and Disney, right? So I had spent the better part of my career like truly believing that there is an audience and there is a need for stories about Latinos in English. We are having this conversation in English after all, and so sadly, I think historically, many of our stories have been relegated to Spanish language media, which is not a knock on Spanish language media. I think they serve a very important purpose, and I think the work that they do is invaluable. But we're also talking about a demographic that has been rapidly changing. Like we are now becoming more and more US born and English dominant. And so I've always felt that there was a need for a space like Delos, right? A place where our stories, are told, and so the first the first step was to sort of like we wanted to do it as a newsletter because it was low threshold, it was just one thing, it's just one story a week. And because it was an email newsletter, it still publishes on the LATimes.com website, but because it's primarily like it goes out as an email, we weren't taking up any print space. So there was no real pushback about, creating this product and seeing how it did. It was kind of a case study, right? And so within, our first year goal metrics was to get the newsletter to 20,000 signups, and we were able to get 25 by month 11, and so to us, it clearly showed like it was great doing it as a newsletter first because we were able to, it was a proof of concept and we were able to show that there was a need and a desire and, for this type and a market for this type of storytelling. And so, you know, my boss, my direct boss, who's the general manager of Latino Initiatives, who oversees Delos, but also oversees LA Times in Espanol, right? So, which makes sense. Like we work in conjunction with each other. But we had been talking about building something like Delos for quite some time, and then it really happened because our executive editor Kevin Merida came on board, right? And Kevin is someone who, prior to coming to the Times, had built up the Undefeated, which was a Black uh, culture and sports site. Um, that's part of ESPN, and it has since rebranded to Anscape. But he helped build that, right? And so coming here to the Times and understanding who lives in Los Angeles, he really saw a need and he really understood our vision, and so quite frankly too, I mean, like, let's face it, the newspaper industry has been going through a very tough last decade or so, maybe 2 decades, right? And so in order for I think, credit to the bosses, I think they realized that in order for the Times to have a viable future or to have any future at all, it needs Latino readers. Since we make up half of the city's population, 40% of the population of California, and like I said earlier, 20% of the country, and that number is only going to keep growing. So I think people saw the writing on the wall and they're like, there's clearly a need for this here. And I think that's why we've gotten the type of support that we have. Like it wasn't like we like have a good budget. Like we're given the tools and the resources to succeed in this mission. And, and I think it's because there's an understanding that this isn't some fad. Like we're not going away, we're going to be part and parcel of this country for a long, long time. And if not us, someone was going to do it, And so, yeah, that's largely how we ended up here.
No, that's great. In terms of timing, though, when you first initially started that conversation, when you were kind of thinking about it, ideating that this is what you wanted to do, and then when you to the point where you were able to then launch the online platform, how much time transpired between those two kind of occurrences?
The newsletter launched in November of 2020,
Hmm.
and it was something that I had actually pitched several years beforehand, and it sort of sat in the back burner, and then my newsroom, like other newsrooms across the country, basically had these internal reckoning conversations about our coverage in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And
Mm-hmm.
it was during that period in which this project that I had pitched kind of like it that's I believe it's one of the reasons why, it got greenlit, because there was an understanding and that media as a whole, not just to single out the LA Times, but media as a whole has been, you know, undercovering, you know, communities of color. And
Mm-hmm.
so that, because the idea for this was already in the works, it had already been submitted. It's the reason why, like, it was easier to greenlight an idea that had already been pitched, right? And
Yeah.
so that was, we're talking about early 2020, um, and the project got greenlit, and then the team behind it discussed as to what it would entail and what it would look like, and then we were up and running by November 2020.
Wow.
And in terms of the planning for Delos, that kind of began at the beginning of, in the middle of 2021, so
Mm.
a year and a half or so after having launched, the my boss, pitched an idea of wanting to sort of scale up the newsletter, and
Mm-hmm.
that eventually became the foundation for Delos, right? And a lot of the learnings that we've taken, like the newsletter has been very instrumental in learning things about this audience that we were able to then scale up, right? And so it really was a great test, case study. It really helped us learn a lot about what Delos would look like. And then we launched officially in July of 2023. So this past July. Um,
Yeah.
so we're already in like month two, you know.
Congratulations.
Thank
That's
you.
awesome. And so tell me about the types of stories that you're covering. And does the newsletter still exist? Do you guys still put out a newsletter also?
Yeah, we put the newsletter out every week. We're still
Okay,
doing that.
awesome.
I just feel like we had grown that audience, and so it made no sense to just discard it after we had built it up.
Right. That's smart. Yeah.
And yeah, and this week, we're recording this on the week of 9/11, which you know, in addition to, the terrorist attack in New York, 9/11 has significance for the Chilean community. 9/11 was the start of the coup that, overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende and resulted in the dictatorship of, Pinochet. And this
Hmm.
week's newsletter was a first person account from my colleague, Martina Ibanez Baldor, who's also design director of Delos,
Hmm.
writing about her father, who was actually a political prisoner you know, in the days after the coup. And
Wow.
it was, for us, it was great to be able to tell that story, to sort of highlight that these aren't just things that happen, like they don't exist in a vacuum, that there are consequences and that there are, you know, like lives are altered because of these events. And so it was a way to tie it to that. But yes, the newsletter runs every Thursday,
Hmm.
and the subject matter of the newsletter really ranges. Like, as long as it's, like, to answer your question, I feel like there's an element of anything can be a Delo story, as long as it answers or tries
Mm,
to answer the question of what does it say about Latinidad, right? And so
Right.
that allows
Right.
us to cover entertainment, politics, sports, as long as we're able to sort of fit through that lens.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's such an expansive and broad topic to cover that it's a little overwhelming too. I would think in terms of what makes the cut, what doesn't make the cut, especially from week to week. And it sounds like you take a more holistic approach from what happened in history, but also what's happening in current events. But it's pretty expansive. So I mean, I don't envy you in having to decide from week to week or day to day what stories are in and what stories are not.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, and it's also, it can be a challenge, right? Because we do have finite resources, and I there are stories that we could be covering, but we might not have the bandwidth. to do so. But our goal is to, like I said, tell as many of our stories as possible, and to also, I'll be fully honest, we do have an agenda, and that is to increase representation and visibility for the Latino community,
Hmm.
and so, especially in media. So
Hmm.
our goal is to hold people accountable in that regard. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, I mean, it's a lot of work, but it's very rewarding,
Yeah.
and I think some of it is quantifiable, and others, forms of successes are much more like difficult to really, like, you can't really put a number on it, right? It's just like knowing, so
Hmm.
something that's really like, I'll give you an example. Bringing collaborators here that are clearly talented, you know, and who grew up in Los Angeles, but they never really saw themselves being as like working on an LA Times story or working on art that ended up in an LA Times story. There's always this sort of ivory tower reputation
Oh
that
yeah.
the LA Times can have,
Yeah.
and the fact that we're able to bring these people into the fold, and that we're not doing them favors, like they're doing us favors. Like they're so talented that, like, we want their work, we want to feature their work, and to be able to make that happen is truly rewarding.
And I imagine that you said that that's part of the agenda is kind of opening those doors and bringing in more of that talent, highlighting more of that talent that's in the community that for whatever reason they just haven't been at the forefront. They just haven't had access to that ivory tower.
Hmm.
I think is that I know that that's part of the mission, and I think that's an important part. But there's also I feel like a business case for sure. As you alluded to at the beginning, we're not going anywhere as far as Latinos and the readership and things like that. So I think there's definitely a business case to be made as well. That you're probably seeing in terms of the numbers as well, in terms of the engagement, in terms of the volume. Would you say that's the case as well?
100%, right? And I mean, again, we're talking about a huge subset of the U.S. population that's being ignored, right? Imagine,
Hmm.
think of it this way: if Latinos were our own country, we would have 60 million people, right? That's bigger. That's more than the population of Italy, you know?
Hmm.
And, like, imagine if you're a country like Italy and you don't have a paper covering your needs or your concerns, right? To me, like, that is baffling. And going back to your, framing of this making business sense, like, 100%, like, I don't think I need to tell you, that Latinos are very brand loyal, and it's there we're for better or worse, I think in a lot of cases for worse, we're pretty good consumers, and so I think we are well past the point where we have to try to justify our existence. At this point, I am of the mindset of, if you ignore Latinos, you do so at your own peril. Like, the writing is in the wall, like,
Right, right.
so that's
Uh,
I agree, there's definitely a strong business case to be made.
Not only that, but I think on the corporate side, on the when you start thinking about ad sales and things like that, I mean, every major corporation, or just about every major corporation, is working on their diversity strategy, and a big part of that diversity strategy is the Latino market, and so I think having a product like this also is pretty smart from a business perspective, because it gives you a natural platform where you can build, not just something that you throw up and you're like, hey, here's something in Spanish, but something that you can build a little bit more organically. I would think with your team that you're able to kind of figure out, like, okay, what makes sense, what works, what doesn't work, and something that's a little bit more authentic.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Like, we wanna we're not trying to explain our culture, we're trying to chronicle it and document it, and I think one of the biggest challenges that mainstream media faces is that they try to be explanatory about who we are, and,
Hmm.
like, if you're really, like, let's say this, if you're into the genre Mexican regional, right? And you come across a story about it, but it's explaining the basic things to you, then why would you read it? It's a waste of your time. It's telling you things you already know, right? And so for
Yeah.
us, it allows us to have those much more in-depth conversations, and to me, like, there was a sense of urgency to get this product and project off the ground, because as I mentioned earlier, someone was eventually going to do it, and I'd rather it be us, and I'd rather it be now. The way that I've described how I felt about the potential of Delos is knowing that we're on the cusp of a massive gold rush, and like people might just now be hearing about it, but we're already here digging. Like we
Hmm.
we we have like being first, being first to market, so to speak, in terms
Right.
of creating this type of space within a legacy media institution. Really gives us huge advantages and gives us like light years in my mind of an advantage in terms of figuring things out as we go along, right? Because um I mean, like I said, we're not going anywhere, and I think it makes no business sense for any company or any industry to not recognize that we exist and that not recognize
Mhm.
that we're pretty good consumers too.
Yeah, and I think your background, I mean, in terms of coming from Me Too and these other platforms, that I would say we're really kind of at the cusp of the what's been happening in the Latino market, where you really are consuming content differently, but creating content differently. I think as well. I think it's not preaching to the masses now. It's like kind of give me something interesting to read that I can understand from a cultural perspective. That it's going to relate to me, and I can kind of relate it to an article I saw on your website that's for Karin Leon, and I was like, oh, that's an interesting read. I mean, like the way you were talking, the perspective that you guys took on it, I thought was an interesting spin. That for me, somebody who consumes mostly English market, mainstream media, but who listens to Spanish language music, it really kind of hit that at that sweet spot that I was like, oh, that's an interesting article. I want to read that. I want to hear more about it. I want to see more stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's you bring up Mexican regional music, right? Which is it's going through it's having quite the moment,
Hmm.
and that doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like that has been decades in the making, right? And like we are
Hmm.
now like growing up. I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas,
Same here.
and oh, are you really?
Edinburgh, Texas.
Oh, I grew up in Hidalgo. My parents now live in McAllen,
Oh, that's
close to
crazy.
Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Puro
having
956.
exactly, and it's funny every single time I mention the RGV in the newsletter. I always make that joke. I always inserted it.
Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
but it's having grown up in the valley, right? It's something where like you hear it everywhere, right?
Hmm.
And oftentimes, like, it's always been like Ramon Ayala or Lalo Mora or all these artists who are much older men, and like we are
Hmm.
now like this music has existed in the US for quite a bit of time because of migration, right? Because migration patterns from in the 90s, like that's when this music really started. That's when really like if you want to trace like the success of Mexican regional, you start back then. You start back like
Hmm.
during the migrant circuit, when these acts were you know, playing here for these immigrant communities. And now those immigrant communities have had children, and those children have grown up listening to the Ramon Ayalas or the Tigres del Norte or the Tucanes de Tijuana, and like they're being influenced by them, and they are now making that type of music, right? So you have a whole new generation of kids, of musicians and of artists like doing this, taking over this genre, and while the music is in Spanish, there's also like a lot of the audience speaks English as well, and
Hmm.
so in our mind was, yeah, there is a need and there is an audience for coverage about Mexican regional music that goes a little bit much more in depth, you know, in English. And so I'm glad you mentioned that Karin Leon story because it really, to me, is an example of the kinds of stories that we can do.
No, and I really that's what struck me when I was looking at your content. I thought that was like the epitome of kind of what Delos could do and is doing. I think to your point, but I think it's globalizing that music that has traditionally been from one generation Mexican regional music, but now you have artists like Karol G, Bad Bunny that are also trying to kind of like dip their feet a little bit
Yeah.
into that style of music, which before was unheard of. It wasn't like, not that they couldn't, but nobody really was doing it anymore. So I think I think it really speaks to the now of the younger generations and the future generations that are coming up behind that, maybe have an affinity to their culture, have an affinity to that music, but maybe they don't understand it completely.
Yeah, right. And so for us, that's a beat, so to speak, that we can own. We are covering extensively. I mean, another example that I'm particularly proud of is has been the way in which we covered the controversy surrounding Yaritza y Esencia. We
Oh yeah.
reported on the backlash on what happened, but then our columnist Susie Exposito actually sat down with the band and asked them about it and interviewed about them, and like interviewed them how they felt about it, which is something that no other English outlet had,
Mhm.
and then
And it was such a huge story.
it was a massive story, right? And
Yeah.
and then on top of that, we also sent a writer to Yakima Valley to write about the Mexican food there, like really give that
Mhm.
perspective, and to us, like that was a good way to keep reporting on this story, right? It wasn't just like, oh, they said these things and that's the controversy and that's it. Like, no, there was more to it, and so we dug deep and we were able to do three different stories, and
And I think it merits it because I feel like it not only was it the story of what happened to them and what happened, with what they said, but it was a story that so many people could relate to because if you looked anywhere on social media, people were saying like, "Oh shit, I gotta teach my kids to to not embarrass me when they go to Mexico. That they're gonna be like, I don't like the food, or I don't drink my cokes like that and stuff like that." So people were relating, like even though it was a funny joke, people were relating like but the parents like our parents generations were like wait a minute, that could be my kid, and then us identifying is like wait, that could have been me, like, or that could have been some of my kid that did that,
yeah.
that made that mistake.
No, and and
uh
and that's a thing. I feel like the story was more than just about some kids making some comments. I think it really highlighted the very tenuous relationship that exists between Mexico and Mexicans and
mhm,
Mexican Americans. Having
mhm,
grown up in the border, I always considered myself very Mexican because of my proximity to Mexico. But, if I go into interior Mexico, sure, our skin color might be the same, but I'm going to be seen as an American. And I think these kids were coming to terms with that distinction, like the fact that there's always been kind of a tenuous relationship between Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Like we're seen as less Mexican because we were born here or we were raised here because we speak Spanish or English rather, right? And
mhm.
that's not an isolated experience, as you mentioned. It's fairly universal, and so to me, that story really merited that type of coverage, that extensive type of coverage.
So tell me about the future plans, as you're as you're growing, as you're continuing to scale, as you're continuing to gain audience. What are you thinking about? What are the plans that you're making, or the discussions that you and the editorial team are having about what's to come?
One of the projects that much of the Delos team leadership kind of worked on and kind of launched was the LA Times Dia de Muertos digital altar, and so
Mhm.
for those of you who are not familiar with it, in 2020, we built what we call the digital altar. This was during the height of COVID, and I'm sorry, not 2020, 2021. It
Mhm.
was, we were still in lockdown, and a lot of in Los Angeles, there are a lot of um, public events for Dia de Muertos. It's a really big holiday here. It's really been
Yeah.
taking foot with the Mexican American Latino community here in Los Angeles. It's been you've seen a lot of like younger Latinos using it as a means and younger Mexican Americans and Mexicans to connect with their heritage. And
Mhm.
so every year there's always a lot of events here in Los Angeles. And because of COVID, they were shut down for 2021. And what we wanted to do was create a space that had that communal sense of remembrance. Like you weren't
Mhm.
alone in your memories. It was sort of a public event. And so what we ended up doing was we created this tool in which our readers could make an ofrenda to a loved one who had passed. And what that
Mhm.
entailed was they could upload a picture of that loved one, and it would also give them the option of including a little message for them, a little bit of writing. And so we put this together in a digital altar. And our first year, we kind of did it on the fly. When we came up with the concept for the project, our expectation, our best case scenario was we would maybe get 40 to 50 submissions. We ended up getting over
Hmm.
1,000, and
Wow.
to us, it was very indicative that there was a big need and desire for something like this. And so the following year, which was last year, was year two of it, right? And so we did the digital ultra as well, but by this point, the events had reopened and you were having these public gatherings. So what we did to sort of one up ourselves from the year before was to build an actual Dia de Muertos altar, and we built one for the event here in Los Angeles at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, Noche de Muertos. And it was
Mm.
it was really cool. It was like a way for us to bridge that gap between the online world and the real world, and so it was
Hmm.
kind of scaling that project up, right? And so this year is going to be our third year, and we're also looking to scale it up again. And so we're still working on that plan, but we're going to go even bigger um, than we did last year. And so that's coming up in November. We're also, October is around the corner, and obviously it's spooky season, and Latinos love horror. And so we're going to be
Oh
doing
yeah.
a collection of stories centering around Latinos and horror and their love of horror. And it may or
Mm.
may not include a short fiction component to it, but that is immediately in the works. And our goal is to also venture outside of just text. I did mention that we were platform agnostic, and what some of that looks like is doing live events, sort of
Hmm.
doing organizing meetups, and just sort of being out in the world and, interacting with our audiences. And we also have some other projects that are in the works that are a little too early in the development stage to really say with much, clarity as to what they are. But we're just trying to, feel like our approach is like we're very fortunate to be, you know, fairly well funded and well resourced, and our goal is to do as much as we can so that we can ask for more and do even more. So that's sort of our mindset.
For those people that are thinking like they're not in the LA market, but they're thinking they're listening to this podcast, they're watching this podcast, and they're thinking about, and it'd be great to have something like this in our market. It'd be great to have something like this, in our local paper as well. What would you say in terms of implementing or beginning to do something that's maybe not on the scale of what you guys are doing, because they don't have the entire team that you all have, but what would you say in terms of starting to kind of move in that direction of creating more authentic, organic content that really ties into the consumer, that at the end goal is the one who's going to be reading this and consuming this content.
Yeah, I was recently and by recently I mean in July. So again, time is a blur. At the National Association of Hispanic Journalists annual conference in Miami, and we did a panel, and something that I like the pitch for the panel was, how to pitch and launch Latino products within legacy media, right? And
Mhm.
the obviously the conditions that, like, the things that needed to happen for Delos and before that the Latinx files to get off the ground, like they were kind of unique, right? Obviously, as I mentioned, none of this would really be happening had George Floyd not been murdered, and it had forced those conversations internally across the nation. And I'm not saying it needs something like that needs to happen for you to get, your project off the ground. But the biggest piece of advice that I would give people is to, instead of trying to justify our existence or our value as a whole, take it as a matter of fact and communicate that, right? I said earlier, ignore us at your peril. I think there's something very powerful in that, in that framing, because I'm personally am done trying to justify my community and my culture, et cetera, et cetera. And like,
Hmm.
thankfully, I'm in a position where I can do something about it. And so, not to ramble, but I do feel like pointing out that other projects already exist and that if you don't do it, you're just going to be left in the dust. I feel like that FOMO can be very powerful, because it's true. We're not the only, like, while we are the only dedicated vertical within broader, legacy media targeting Latinos, and by legacy media, I mean, newspapers, right? Like, obviously,
Hmm.
NPR has Oye, and NBC has NBC Latino, and Axios has Axios Latino.
Hmm.
But, so there's already a precedent there. Like, the groundwork has already been set, the foundation has already been set, and people are going to build on this. And if you are a decision maker and you're not seeing this, then I really question why you're a decision maker in the first place, and it's like I said, like, we are going to be a significant part of the future. And if you fail to recognize that, that's ultimately on you, and
Hmm.
something that I mentioned at this panel, speaking to reporters from other papers, other big papers who were, envious of what we've been able to do so far because they want to replicate that. I told them, tell your bosses that if they don't greenlight your projects, I'm promising you, I'm gonna go into their backyard and eat their lunch. And
Yeah.
so that's my approach. Kind of bully my way. Like, bully our way into, like, visibility.
And that was going to be my follow up to that was, as a community, what can we do to support your efforts? Because I don't think we have to be in your market to consume your product and to, enjoy it and to be able to, like, share it with our friends and family. I mean,
Yeah.
how can we support what you're doing even if we're not in your market
Well, and
directly?
even though the majority, like, LA is our home base, and we do prioritize and do focus a lot on in Los Angeles, but underserved Latino communities don't just exist in LA, they exist everywhere in Chicago, New York, Texas, Florida, and our goal is to be able to tell those stories as well. And we've done a pretty good job at telling stories outside of LA. Um, so, if you read our stories, like, I guarantee you'll find something that you like, and you can find that at delosangelestimes.com or latimes.com/delos. And I would also say that to follow us on Instagram, which is also at the Los Angeles Times, because that to me really is broad. Like, we have so much cool, long, like, short form video content that will resonate with people outside of LA, since it's not necessarily LA specific, and so I would encourage people to look us up. And something that I should mention is we are in front of the paywall. That was a
Hmm.
decision that we pushed
Mm.
for internally, because the way that we saw it was that, historically speaking, the Los Angeles Times has not done the best job in covering and catering to Latino communities. And so, as we were conceiving of this project, it didn't feel right to go like, hey, we created this product for you, even though we've ignored you historically, but in order for you to access us, we have to get your money first, And
Yeah.
so right now our approach was like, let's put everything in front of the paywall, build up that audience, build up that trust, build up that community, and then, change once we have enough, or figure it out, because it really is about rebuilding trust. I feel like that
Yeah.
is our path to, success, is by building and constantly working on, bolstering the trust between ourselves and our audience.
And I think even though it is a legacy media outlet, I think it's building a relationship. So it's not a legacy news outlet with the Latino community to some degree, because it's kind of a first entry point. It's kind of, hey, get to know us, build a relationship as you're
Hmm.
sharing. That it's build a relationship with that audience that maybe they've known about the publication. It's not that they don't know about it, but they haven't always felt as identified with the
that it wasn't for
publication.
them, right? And our goal is to
Right.
change that. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Anything else that you want to add or say?
No, I mean, I think definitely like check us out. I really obviously I'm biased, but I think we're doing some cool, fun, unique things,
I
and
would agree.
I think there's something for everyone. Our Instagram is so great. Like I've really enjoyed the stuff that we've been doing there, the sort of the man on the street videos, and just you know that our goal is to platform as many voices as possible, and that's our aim. And give us a shot. And if you like what you see, share it. Tell a friend about it. And if you have some feedback, we have avenues open to take in that feedback, because at the end of the day, like, our goal is to not be the end all authority on what it means to be Latino, because anyone who does that is just lying to you and will never succeed. We are 60 plus million people, and no, there is no singular Latino experience, right? And so if you feel like there are certain aspects of Latinidad or Latino community that we're ignoring, like, we are very receptive to feedback, because it's a way that we get better, so please, yeah, just interact, let us know what you think, and yeah, check us out.
Well, Fidel, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me. This was truly a delight.
Thanks for listening to that conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got a lot out of that conversation with Fidel, and that you were inspired to learn more about De Los. If, like he said, he gave you all the locations to go find that publication, De Los. If you're interested in collaborations, one thing that we didn't get to talk about during the podcast was specifically about bringing more diverse and more Latino voices to De Los on Los Angeles Times. So if you have an idea, if there's a topic that you would be interested in them covering, definitely reach out to Fidel and his team. But with that, I will see you on the next episode. As always, if you enjoyed what you heard, give us a like, share the episode, go to your listening platform and give us 5 stars. Hasta luego, amigos. See you next time. Bye.